Now, today's talk kicks off a lecture series we're calling the Unprecedented Seasons. The theme of the series is looking at current social issues such as the pandemic, social justice and civil rights, climate change through the lens of memoir and biography. You'll find more about the series and upcoming presentations on our website under the events listing. Today's presenter is DJ Lee. DJ is a Regents Professor in the English Department at Washington State University. And there, DJ teaches literature, environmental humanities, and creative writing. DJ co-directs the Visiting Writers Series and serves as a university ombudsman, and is also a scholar fellow at the Black Earth Institute. DJ has published more than 100 creative and scholarly works, including 8 books, most recently the award-winning memoir, Remote, Finding Home in the Bitterroots, which was published by Oregon State University Press last year. You should have received a discount code in your email reminder. Take advantage of that. It's 30% off plus free shipping. DJ and Catherine Newfont co-edited a book called The Land Speaks, New Voices at the Intersection of Oral and Environmental History from Oxford University Press. Full disclosure, I contributed a chapter to that book. Our presenter today spent significant portions of the last 15 years in the secluded mountains of Idaho and Montana, conducting the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness History Project. The project ended in March 2020, just as the pandemic forced people around the globe to isolate, quarantine, and social distance. Covering topics such as ecosickness, eco-arts, wilderness history and ethics, and right relations between humans and the natural world, as examined by Indigenous scholars, DJ's presentation today reflects on how wilderness as a concept and a place can help us cope with the pandemic. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to DJ.
Thank you, Jamie. And the first thing I am going to do, if I can, is just share my screen briefly. This one. So the place that I'm going to be specifically talking about is the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness of Idaho and Montana, that straddles the northern Rockies there. And I wanted to give a big thanks to Jamie. Jamie and I actually first met in the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness, or, you know, on the border of it. We were at a memorial for one of the most important foresters of the area, a guy named Bud Moore. So speaking at the Forest History Society is extra special for me, and to have Jamie emceeing. Just a couple more photos. There's wild rivers, deep canyons, tall peaks, and beautiful night sky in this place. Yeah, I'm here to talk, as Jamie said, about wilderness and isolation in regards to the pandemic. American wilderness, as originally conceived by Howard Zonnheiser and other early framers of the Wilderness Act, like Bob Marshall, as many of you watching this know, was intended to protect and cherish remoteness. The most famous line of the Wilderness Act, an area where humans are visitors and do not remain. What many people found in protecting and traveling through these landscapes in the wilderness preservation system, whether that be the Sierras or the Everglades or some of the Midwestern wildernesses like Isle Royale, Hawaii volcanoes, much of Alaska, is that remoteness and isolation from other people actually brought them into a sense of intimacy with the natural world, so that isolation morphed into community, the community of Earth, to quote both the Wilderness Act and the Blackfeet Monacan wilderness scholar J. Hansford Vest. But remoteness and isolation of the pandemic is regarded as negative and even destructive. Lockdowns and orders to shelter in place are devastating the economy, we're told. People are suffering from loneliness. As a public, we're reminded of the risks of isolation. The Health and Resource Services Administration tells us that isolation significantly increases our risk of premature death from all causes. That risk may rival those of smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity. Social isolation also increases our risk of dementia and our rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. And the AARP Foundation and United Health Foundation just recently reported what they're calling an epidemic of loneliness. I've seen that with my own family. I have an extended family in Idaho and Washington State, and I'm sure most of you can say the same about yourselves, your family, and your friends. So these two ideas and realities, wilderness and the pandemic, came home to me firsthand, as Jamie was saying, on March 15th, 2020, when the first shelter-in-place orders were established in northern Idaho, Moscow, where I was living then, and where I began to work remotely at my university. The shelter-in-place orders happened around March 15th, as I said, and that was actually the exact release date of my book, which is called Remote. So I was working remotely and releasing remotely. The book is about the Selway-Bitterroots, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But I titled it that, many years earlier, because in my travels through the area, I heard again and again that this wilderness is one of the most isolated and lonely places in the lower 48 states. And when I heard that, it was always said with a matter of respect. Loneliness was a positive thing. And as I experienced the remoteness and isolation of the place many, many times over the years, I also grew to love it. So because all of my readings and events for this book were canceled or moved, some of them were moved online, I was in a position to think deeply about remoteness in relation to the pandemic and to wilderness. And one of the first things that occurred to me when I learned that the coronavirus probably arose because of the increasing human presence in wild areas is that increasing human invasion of the natural world, is that it was the kind of wake-up call. I mean, a horrifying wake-up call, but a wake-up call nonetheless. The coronavirus is still thought by most scientists to have jumped from animals to humans. It is, in effect, an eco-sickness. And I happened to be reading for my eco-criticism reading group, Heather Hauser's book, Ecosickness, at about that same time. And Hauser talks about the big positive consequences of eco-sickness. And those being that it makes us confront ecological connectedness, that we aren't separate, we are part of the living earth, part of that community. And it forces us to think ethically about our collective bodily and environmental futures. In a much harsher way, Hauser's idea of eco-sickness has been echoed by Jane Goodall, who in no uncertain terms links the pandemic not to keeping our social distance with the wild, to not keeping our social distance with the wild. In other words, to exploitation and extraction of the natural world. In several interviews over the past year, and all you have to do is Google it, she has said that we must stop destroying natural habitats. And she gets into some specifics, or our species is doomed. Robin Wall Kimmerer of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation also touches on this, but in another way. She says that and this is again in interviews and a few online events that she's done. She says the pandemic is making us, quote, unlearn a lot of things and remember things we have been made to forget, namely taking care of our place and creating or maintaining a reciprocal relationship with the natural world. So in one interview, Kimmerer refers to her wonderful book, Gathering Moss. And she says, one thing that moss and maybe all plants teach us is how to stay home. She says, by staying home, people and mosses, and I would say plants in general, are able to engage in a reciprocal relationship with place. The place is taking care of you, but in order for that to happen, you have to take care of the place, which mosses do and which people can do when they're rooted in place. So Kimmerer appeals to me because of the intimacy embedded in remoteness that she hints at. And I experienced that intimate remoteness firsthand, as I said, in the Selway-Bitterroot wilderness over 15 years of traveling and volunteering and conducting oral histories. I partnered with a scholar and historian from the University of Idaho. And before I wrote the book Remote, and he and I collected 16 cubic feet of documents and photos and over 50 oral histories. And that resulted in, I'm just going to share my screen again for a second. That resulted in a big archive at the University of Idaho, and yeah, a big archive at the University of Idaho, and a series of podcasts that draw on the oral histories, as well as all the transcribed oral histories and the preserved oral histories. It also resulted in 3 books. Jamie mentioned The Land Speaks right here, but also Encounters with the People, written and oral accounts of the Nez Perce life in 1853. That's another kind of archival book. I'm not sure why that picture is like increasing in size. And then my book Remote. Okay, so I'm just gonna transition for a minute because remoteness was not originally my comfort zone. I grew up in Seattle and spent my entire life in cities, and I spent some time in Calgary, Alberta, and most of my scholarly life had been spent in libraries in New York City and London, England, some of the least isolated places on the planet in terms of human population density. What I didn't know is that my grandparents had once lived in the Selway-Bitterroot wilderness in the early 20s through the early 40s. And my grandfather, whom I never knew, was an early forester. He was someone my grandmother wouldn't talk about, so there was this big family mystery that I was eager to find out when, on her deathbed, she bequeathed to me a box of documents, photos, and letters and diaries. That bequeathment on her deathbed was the beginning of my interest in the Selway-Bitterroot and the interest in locating the documentary history, which we sort of did, but there's always gaps, of course. In the process of doing that, I'd never really been to an isolated or remote place before, but but I did, as I said, I just grew to love it, and it felt like the least remote place, even in its remoteness, or because of its remoteness. And I feel like in March of last year, when I was forced to isolate in Moscow, which is about 2 hours from the Selway-Bitterroot, I was starting to in a position to internalize some of that reciprocity between wildland and human engagement that Kimmerer talks about. Although wilderness at that time really could only be not these multi-million swaths of land, but you know, the wilderness, the wild at my doorstep. And I found that in that period, I had a desire to connect with the earth, not intellectually or through writing or even creative writing, like not through that symbolic form, but through my body and through my hands. And for reasons that are still inexplicable to me, but are becoming clearer, the first thing I did was I set up this hand paper making station on my back porch in Moscow, Idaho, and started fashioning these paper sculptures. I used fiber from plants. Some of the plant fiber I already had in my freezer, because I dabble in paper making anyway, but some of it was from the moss growing under the aspen trees in my backyard that I soaked and boiled and got the pulp out. To make paper, for those of you who don't know, you have to stand over a vat of water and swish your hands back and forth for many, many minutes. And you actually get this rush of oxygen from the water. So as I was, you know, making paper, I was kind of you know, with the plants that were in my place, I was also internalizing some of the crises of the pandemic, which was lack of oxygen for some of the people who were suffering under ventilators. And then anyway, once you do that, once you stand over a vat, you pull plant fiber through a mold that's usually made of mahogany or pine, and then you tear it into strips, and then you can make a sculpture. And I'm going to share my screen one more time and show you let's see, this. Let's see. So again, like I said, it was in some ways inexplicable to me why I was doing this, but I just felt I needed to connect physically and bodily with the natural world and with the pandemic, and this was the result. What I did is I ended up making masks, and the masks were completely useless. Like no one is going to be protected from the virus from these. They have holes in them. They're made out of porous fiber. They are attached with, you know, little twine from just a different plant that I had collected earlier. But you know, I couldn't create N95s, but I could co-create or collaborate with my place, the place where I was, to show how eco-sickness might be mitigated by eco-intimacy in a productive way. And I lived in a place where people were very anti-mask. A lot of people in my community were in northern Idaho were not wearing masks as they walked around grocery stores and sidewalks. So I feel like I was trying to say that mask wearing isn't anti-freedom at all. It's natural, it's wild. It's as close to the environment as we can get. And it wasn't until the following August that I was able to travel back to the Selway-Bitterroot. I hadn't been there for quite a while, and install the masks on some of the wild willows near the river, near the Selway. And I took a bunch of photos, and I'm still trying to figure out what it all means. But I think it's, again, emphasizing that masks are part of the community of Earth, even as they help protect the health of our human community. And that's all. Thank you.
Well, that's, thank you, DJ. That is, to say the least, thought-provoking. So you, at the end there, you were saying that masks are a part of nature. Did I understand that correctly? And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. What comes to mind is how plants and animals camouflage themselves, and which is in essence a mask. And so I'm wondering if that's something that had consciously come into you during this work process, and if not, but if you could just kind of speak to any of that.
That's really interesting. And like I said, at the time it was completely unconscious. I just knew I couldn't just be in my house in front of a computer. I had to be outside. It was, you know, getting nice. I had to be doing something. I couldn't leave my house. And I just needed to create, and I ended up creating these masks. It was only later that I did a lot of research onto why there is, especially in the US, where there's such an anti-mask bias, and that sense of covering the self as if the face, you know, as if our face represents who we are. And that, you know, to cover it is somehow not just a violation of freedom, as some people think of it, but this this erasure of our being. But, you know, even the cloth masks that are out there are still formed, unless they're plastic, which I doubt they are, they're still formed from fiber. And so they're a way, they're a way of connecting with the, you know, the face, the most important part of our what we show to the world, of unifying, or, you know, having intimacy. I never did think of the idea of camouflaging, but I really like it. I also thought that they looked like nests or beehives. So and I didn't plan that, it just happened. So they look like some of the natural forms that exist in the wild. And one of the photos that I was showing you is actually blooms hanging off of a shore. And they look very similar to those blooms. I don't know what kind of flower it was, but thank you for that question.
Sure. So we've got quite a number of questions here, and I'm going to link two of them together, one from Gary Myers and the other from Donna Sinclair. Donna asks, if in your book, do you document the story of your grandparents and your grandfather as a forester? And Gary asks, can you talk a bit more about your book, how it's organized and the perspective you take? So here's your chance to do the shameless plug for your book, Remote.
Thank you, Donna. And just
Gary?
Donna is going to be speaking in February, so I hope you guys all tune in.
More shameless plugging.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Thank you for both of those questions. Yes, I definitely document my grandfather. He was a mystery to me and to the Forest Service. There was a lot of documentation about him. One, that he actually had Indigenous ancestry, which I found that in the Forest Service archives. Several times there's a photo of him. I mean, I couldn't verify it. Although he was from Cherokee County, Kansas, but I could never really verify it. Part of the book is me trying to figure out who he was, because my grandmother, whom I was very close to, hated him, and I never knew him. And so when she died and gave me this box of stuff, most of it pointing to the Selway-Bitterroot, where he had come in like 1920, I felt like it was her urging me to figure him out. But I never, if you read the book, I get close, but he remains elusive. And so that's Donna, and then Gary. The book is organized in a non-linear fashion. And I struggled with this so much. That's why it took me so long to write it. About 8 of the chapters are told in present tense, and that's me trying to, my friend Connie Saylor Johnson went missing in the Selway-Bitterroot about the time that I was finishing the manuscript, so I had to rewrite it because a lot of the book is about what is hidden and mysterious and missing in wilderness, and so her story had to be incorporated in. And then the rest of it is past tense. So it kind of toggles between present and past. The other thing it has is every chapter, except for the ones in present tense, have a photograph. And a lot of them are historical photographs. That's my grandmother there in the white from like the 1930s. Then there are a few contemporary photos, but the photos, if you line them all up, they tell their own separate visual narrative. So it has some interesting structural things going on. Thank you so much for that question.
Sure. So Michelle Riley asks a really, yeah, I like this question. And she says, you put installations in a designated wilderness area, which, as she understands it, is against or not allowed under the Wilderness Act. And although you use natural material, so are the rocks that people stack, and those are considered unauthorized installations. So I'm sure other people are wondering, you know, if you could tell us about the installations in terms of permanence and the Wilderness Act.
That's a great question, Michelle. And, you know, I did fudge when I told you that, because I wasn't inside the boundary. I was actually on the Selway River Road, which is it's about a 20-mile road, a gravel road that leads up to a place called Race Creek. And then you have to hike in about 1.5 miles to get to the wilderness boundary. But that boundary between wilderness and non-wilderness, especially when you're in the radius, I mean, we all know that what flows out of, that things flow out of wilderness and flow in, and that the boundary is a permeable thing. But technically, yeah, I did not break the law. It was outside of the boundary. But I feel like that Selway River Road, and Jamie, you know what I'm talking about, is the wilderness. I mean, people drive and car camp there, but it's so close to the wilderness that it just feels like one and the same to me.
It's the wilderness where you were was feeling not inside a blue line, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
So Andrew Larson asked a question that I think many of our attendees today will be interested to learn. He says, as a university professor, how do you bring wilderness into your teaching? What do you think is possible or missing in this area? That's a very broad question. So if you want to just address the question of how do you bring wilderness into your teaching, feel free to limit yourself there.
Yeah, I mean, I've taught a couple of classes just on wilderness literature, wilderness, wilderness culture. I team taught a class with a biologist on wilderness. And I'm going to be proposing another class for freshmen on wilderness. And, you know, it's usually in regard to what wilderness is. I mean, it's so interesting through the years. When I first started doing this, like in 2012 or something, I asked, you know, people what wilderness is, and the kids would say, any place where you can't get cell phone coverage. Well, we know, thanks to Elon Musk, that that isn't even true anymore, you know, but that was their definition of wilderness. And you know, I think I love that question to start off a class and to have it continue on, because it, no, you know, we can't really define it. And if we could, I think of wilderness as the Tao, you know, once you can define it, then it's not wilderness anymore. It's that which cannot be defined, but trying to define it is a great way to bring it into a classroom, whether it's just with a unit or with an entire class. Literary texts, Terry Tempest Williams, Barry Lopez, Peter Matheson, you know, some of the standards, and then there's all of these other texts, and then there's this rich, you know, the rich Indigenous history, as well as the Black, you know, African American presence in the wilderness. Carolyn Finney, Cecil Giscombe, Camille Dougie, even Major Jackson. There's Gloria Brown, as you guys are going to hear from Donna Sinclair. So bringing the culture and you know, the cultural diversity with the natural biodiversity together. Yeah, if you want to write me separately, I would be happy to share with you some of my ideas, and I would always look forward to learning more too.
And I'll let folks know that your website, the URL is Debbie J, the initial J, Lee, LEE.com. And you can also learn more about DJ's various projects there. Amy Hay asks, does intent matter to seeking remoteness in nature and us being contained in our homes? So one seeks isolation, the other is imposed on us. So again, she asks, does intent matter to seeking remoteness in nature and us being contained in our homes?
That is a very good question. And that, you know, when you bring an idea like that together, like an overarching idea, there are ways, like isolation, there are ways that it overlaps and informs one another, but also ways that are diametrically opposed. And going into the wilderness because you want that isolation and you want the intimacy with the natural world that feels harder to achieve in more populated places is not the same as isolation in your home, and all you can do is walk around your yard. It takes a different kind of reckoning for sure. It is coming to you rather than you going to it, and that's maybe a really interesting avenue to explore. Like what if isolation is coming to you rather than you seeking it? Is that the difference? And makes going to wilderness, as we all know, there's been study after study that says that it's beneficial to our health. It increases well-being and life expectancy rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and then there's the Japanese practice of forest bathing, which doesn't require, you know, it's immersion in a forested landscape, does not have to be designated or if you will, aesthetically considered wilderness. But they've been doing studies on just, you know, going into an urban park, for example, yeah, things like that. So, which actually it's a nice, Amy, thank you for that question. It's a nice setup for Bob Saint sent in what is more of a comment, but I'll summarize it and turn it into a question. Now, he says in Colorado, the governor had encouraged people to get outside, go outdoors and maintain social distancing, which resulted in the Rocky Mountain National Park really kind of being overrun by visitors. And because of decreased staffing and volunteer monitoring, this led to all sorts of problems like illegal camping, trash piles, problems
He's
with,
on the trail, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and which decreased the wilderness experience. So a question I would have for you then is, there in, I know it's 2 hours away, but if the Selway-Bitterroot, if you know of any similar experiences there, or if you had read of this problem elsewhere. I know here in the Durham area, just in some of our local city or county parks and state parks, you'd go out on a nice day in the spring, and it was happening again this fall, and you pull into the parking area at the trailhead and there's no parking. It was just overrun.
Mhm.
So anyway, were you experiencing that there in your neck of the woods?
No, because it's just so hard to get to, and the areas around the Bitterroots are, there's just, the population is very small. So
Okay.
on the Montana side, there's Missoula, but that's like the biggest town even close, and Missoula is not that big.
Yeah.
Uh, but I came in through the Idaho side, and it's just difficult to get to. So no, we didn't that experience that at all. But I did read about some other cases, and I can't remember where, but I remember being um, kind of horrified at people leaving their feces on the trail and stuff. And yeah, it was a problem. Hmm.
Um, okay. Yeah, it depends, I guess, on proximity to an urban space.
Hmm.
Linda Pace was asking, she says, in pondering mask wearing as part of our cultural history, do you see a parallel between our face mask wearing to stop the virus and the traditional use of masks to frighten away evil spirits? Or I guess, and you could broaden that out to say the wearing of masks for religious purposes.
Yeah. And that's Linda. Thank you so much. After I made those masks kind of subconsciously and drove down to the wilderness boundary and made the installation, I did a lot of research on mask wearing. And in fact, mask wearing is older than human language. That's what I learned. There's a place called the Museum of Masks, I think, and they have they're a legitimate place, but they've done, the history of masks and human experience, and I mean, I think, yeah. So and masks. When I read that, I was like, well, masks are a kind of language in themselves, and like you say, Linda, there's that whole idea of masks to frighten away evil spirits. There's the mask of the carnival, where the world is overturned for a night or for a week, and people can do dangerous things with people wear masks to rob banks. But as you were saying, Jamie, masks are a really important part of religious ceremony and of rituals. And so I think all of these meanings are layered onto the masks. And we, the difficulty and uncomfortability of masks may have to do with just the heavy layer of cultural meaning that we're not really consciously aware of, but that's there nonetheless.
Okay. Molly Tyson has a really interesting question, and it ties into it to our unprecedented seasons, the various topics we're addressing. And she says, I just returned to graduate school after 20 years of working in wilderness areas. Many of her classmates, presumably in their 20s, but anyway, and that's an assumption on my part. Many of my classmates were very anti-wilderness for reasons of it being part of patriarchy, white supremacy, and dispossessing Native Americans from their ancestral lands to establish national parks, etc. When I pressed them on this, if they had actually spent time in actual, big capital W wilderness areas, most answered no. How do you balance the complexity of a difficult history by which wildernesses came into existence and it being possible for it to have other value despite the difficult past? And what have you found the most effective way for translating the experience to students who have not spent any time in wilderness areas?
That's Molly, is that?
Yes, Molly.
That's such a great question, Molly. I actually just finished an essay called Wilderness and Literature for Cambridge University Press that should be coming out next year in a volume. And that whole essay is about that. It's like 7,000 words. It's complicated, it's horrible, and it's nuanced, and you know, it is a masculinist, ableist, patriarchal endeavor. There's no question. Going back to Thoreau, going going back to Gifford Pinchot, who was, as you know, was it Gifford Pinchot who was a member of several eugenics societies,
As well
and
as Teddy Roosevelt's writings about it.
mhm.
Not membership, but certainly.
John Muir's degrading African Americans and Indians in the sea areas that he met. But there's also, I think, an alternate, I think there are several wilderness histories. I don't like to think of just one. So Howard Zonheiser's son, what was his name? I forget. Anyway, he wrote an essay about Zonheiser, who absolutely wanted absolutely saw the Wilderness Act as a social justice act. It was signed within 2 months of the Civil Rights Act and the anti-poverty, I forget the name of that act, by Johnson. And the first line of the Wilderness Act says, "for all people." So he saw it as a social justice institution. And there were people who were working alongside of him, like, and I can't remember their names right now, but they also were, they didn't see it in the way that academic wilderness is portrayed today, as this thing set aside that's pristine and untouched. They absolutely knew that it was native land, that it had been occupied for, thousands, if not millions of years. They were just fulfilling what Bob Marshall, who also was a big advocate for native rights, this idea that we need to preserve it, because if we don't, it will be settled, it will be paved, it will, it was, the Wilderness Act was conceived by Marshall and Leopold and those people right when America was building highways, and they just did not want roads through all of these things. I could go on and on. Anyway, there are, yeah, it's a complicated issue, but the way that I deal with it is that there are several wilderness histories, and they conflict, they intersect, and they sometimes overlap. The final part is that I have talked with a lot of Indigenous people. A lot of them love the fact that the wilderness has been preserved, no matter, even though it has meant, it's a tragic chapter in their history. But the Nimipu, who are the main dwellers in the wilderness that I study, they say that part of their land is as much, is as close to it was when they were robbed of it as any place. So, it was protected, and now it's there for them to use in ways that other places aren't. So I don't know. It's a complicated issue. I hope
it is. And I tell me again what publication that essay will appear in.
It's a collection of essays from Cambridge called Wilderness, and I can't remember, in literature, I can't remember exactly.
Okay.
I can get you the title later.
Okay, well, we'll add that to your bio on our website.
Yeah.
I think we'll take, looks like, we'll do like 2 more questions, if that's
Okay.
all right. Catherine Brenner says, do you have any plans to share your paper mask art in the North Idaho community, that region? Or was this just a personal exercise? So, do you have plans to display them or try and have a formal exhibit?
Yeah, I would like to do that. I would actually like to write something to go along with it to kind of explain some of the complexity of mask wearing and art and the natural environment and kind of explore some of those connections. But they are beautiful when you see them hanging on the willow trees.
Yeah.
I have some video of them too. Yeah. And we probably will have to be wearing masks for a while, even though the vaccine is upon us.
Yeah, and so that touches on, somebody else had asked about if you could say something about experiential writing, and I'll just acknowledge, I'll just link that answer to that question. So I do want to have you briefly touch on Steve Dunsky. Asked if you could say a few words about the role of Bud Moore in the Selway-Bitterroots. And I'll encourage you to talk a bit about your oral history project with Selway-Bitterroot, because I know I'm pretty sure that's how you came to know Bud.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
I did an oral history of Bud about 2 years before he passed, and I got to stay in his house there up on what does he call it? Coyote Forest or something.
there was the one in the Selway-Bitterroot, and then there was he had a second cabin.
Yeah. I think Bud was like essential, especially for the eastern side of the wilderness, the Montana side. I mean, he grew up there. He learned to trap animals there. He rose to, the heights of I think it's Region 1, the Forest Service. Spent some time in DC, was instrumental in,
He was in fire management.
yeah, fireman, instrumental in not containing, changing the 10 a.m. policy in Region 1 for wildland fires, and that first experiment they did on
In the Eagle Cap Wilderness.
yeah. And so yeah, Bud Moore, and then he wrote the book, God, what was it?
It just flew out of my head too. And it's really
the Locksaw Story.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Which I highly recommend people read that, because it's a beautiful mix of Forest Service, wilderness history, or the history of that region.
Yeah.
And his life, it's a bit of a memoir too.
Yeah, it is.
He lived such a fascinating life.
Yeah.
That book is still in print.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's called The Locksaw, Lochsa Story.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about Bud, though, is that and most of my book, I traveled, some of it with a bush pilot named Dick Walker. And Dick Walker was the one who introduced me to Bud. And Dick was, Bud Moore was God to Dick Walker. But Dick kept saying, you got to talk to Bud. You got to put this in about Bud. This has to be in there about Bud. You have to say this about Bud. And the whole time I was writing with Dick, because if you read the book, Dick's kind of a wild man.
Yeah, I've read, and yes, you're right.
Wild man. And Bud was not a wild man in that way. He was more of a professional, and I just grew to love Dick. I just grew to feel like Dick was the embodiment of the wilderness that I knew. And so I tried to fit Bud into my book. I'm trying to find a picture of Dick here. And I really, I really tried to fit Bud into my book, but I just couldn't, because for me, Dick's enthusiasm and his, you know, he's a pilot and he's back there on snowshoes and has a million documents in his house.
Right.
He just, for me, embodied that place. But that's just my experience, you know.
But Bud was more soft-spoken and thoughtful, and
Mhm.
I say this because I wrote about him in the book that you and
Mhm.
Catherine co-edited.
Yeah, right.
So while we're doing shameless plugs, The Land Speaks, you can read a chapter about Bud Moore there.
Yes.
So I think I'm going to just finish up actually with an observation and not really a question. Amy Hay had weighed in. She says, I think a great contrast with Henry David Thoreau is Susan Fenimore Cooper, who sees nature as home rather than wild. Maybe that view makes nature available to all of us, or at least available to more of us. I'll let you respond to that if you wish.
I love that. And who was that who said that?
Amy Hay, she
Amy.
had given us a question earlier, but that's a great observation on her part.
Yeah, and Amy, I mean, I think that ties back into the sense of isolation. I mean, I think because I had internalized all of these lessons about the wilderness, being in like a formal wilderness, when the shelter in place came about for me, I thought that absolutely, like, wilderness is right there. It's right there in that pile of snow outside my window. I don't have to travel 2,000 miles and then drive for a day to go to this big swath of land, although those all are also so important for wild animal and plant habitat. But you know, the wilderness is everywhere, you know, inside my body and outside, everywhere. So thank you for that.
Sure. Well, many thanks to you. Again, our presenter has been DJ Lee. You can learn more about the many projects underway and the many publications at the website debbiejlee.com. Thank you all for staying with us through the Q&A. I think we got through most of them. We'll take a look, and if there's some unanswered ones, we'll try and address them in print form. But anyway, thanks, and we hope to see you back here in about a month. Donna Sinclair will be talking about the U.S. Forest Service and civil rights in the environmental era.